So I don't know if any of you guys have played around with the Holley EFI system at all, so I thought I'd show you the tuning software that they provide. So opening it up on the computer, this is what you'll find. So they give you a bunch of base calibrations that you can use. Even though it says custom, it's really more customized in the fact that it's set up for a certain application already coming straight from Holley. So I go into Mopar, and then kind of the basic options that they give you are just depending on how you want your fuel table set up. So alpha N is primarily driven by your throttle position and your engine RPM. So it's really good for wide open throttle stuff from what I've read. And then the bottom one, there's flow based and VE based. Based on everything I've read for my application, I think the flow based is going to be the correct one to use. So I'll open that one. Once you're in, there's really nothing that pops up immediately. You got to look at your taskbar up top here. And the first thing that I would do is, because I'm not using drive-by-wire, which is what this little icon is at the top, I can go up here and remove that configuration, and that gets rid of it. From there, I go into the system configuration. So ECU configuration first. There's the HP and the Dominator. The HP has a lot less functionality, like it can't control transmissions, can't do a lot of stuff like that. That is the one that I have purchased, so I'll switch it back to that. Then because I opened up a base calibration from Holley, it had a lot of the good information in here already. So obviously size of engine, type of wideband, just some basic like fuel pressure stuff. Talks about your injectors. It's set up for the size of injector that came stock on the engine, which is pretty handy. And then if I go down into ignition parameters, the ignition on this has this 36-2+2 waste spark coil style. So that just tells, it's mainly driven by the trigger wheel coming off the crank. That's what kind of drives what one you select here. And because the engine I have has waste spark coils, meaning there's 2 plugs on each cylinder on this Hemi, and for emissions reasons they made it so that the second spark plug actually fires as well. So that's why they call it a waste spark. It's just from an emissions perspective, it makes it better. You can set your RPM limits. You can do a whole bunch of stuff in here. So once you get your basic stuff set up, you can come down. There's if you want to have a sensor warning, meaning almost like a shift light, think of it like that. If you exceed RPM, oil pressure, goes too low, whatever, you can make it so it pops up with a specific warning. You have basic input-output stuff that's already pre-programmed in, so you can, for electric fans, torque converter controls, timing retards, data logs, CAN bus. So the CAN bus is where I have my digital dash plugged into at the moment. So you just leave it as Holley standard and it sets that up for you. And it's got some other stuff so you can set up staging as well. So closed loop, this is just based on your, the ECU has some self-learning capabilities, which is kind of defined over here. So it will read off of your O2 sensor and adjust the fueling as needed to try to get you back to your target air-fuel ratios, which we'll look at a little bit later. So it's pretty impressive how it can do that, and you can make it so that it doesn't do that. Like kind of once you get a tune that you like, you can lock it in and turn off the self-learning abilities. If you are in a high power application that you've got EGT sensors and stuff like that on each cylinder, you can adjust each cylinder specifically, which is kind of cool. And then it's got a whole bunch of inputs, outputs that you can assign to kind of make everything, if you wanted to plug in something additional that's not typically controlled. From there, you go through, check out your sensors. So manifold air pressure, it's cool. It's got a whole bunch of ones pre-programmed into here. So this is the stock one that came in the car for me, which is handy, or came on the engine, I should say. Coolant temp, same deal. Manifold or intake air temperature. oil pressure sensor, fuel pressure. I don't have mine plugged in at the moment, but I've ordered a fuel pressure sensor that I'll be plugging in, then I'll get it to display that as well. So what it does is it takes all of those readings from all those sensors and kind of the functionality that you put in at the beginning, how you want it to kind of behave, and then it generates fuel and ignition tables. So this is the fuel table. You can do some pretty cool looking little graphs so that it shows you what the kind of the expected flow rate of the system is going to be based on your manifold air pressure. So that's what, when we picked flow-based fueling, that's what it's deciding to use as the axis on this side and RPM on this side. So if we would have picked that alpha N, this axis would have been all based on your throttle position. So if you're 100% throttle, it would obviously pull off of that far line. So that learn ability that we talked about before, if you find you've got a good table that you'd like to more or less save, that you've kind of learned from, or learned and you want to keep, you can transfer it to make it your base table. You can adjust your target air fuels all the way through your different RPM ranges. I have it's blocked off because I didn't choose this tuning style. That's why there's no alpha N. It's got startup enrichment. So you can determine how much additional fuel you want based on the temperature outside. So if it's really cold, you need a little bit more fuel to help get the engine fired than if it's warm outside. Yeah, so that's the kind of the gist of that. And then if you look at spark, it's the same deal, talking about your ignition timing. It's the same two axes that we talked about before. Makes a kind of a neat graph here if you want to pull it up to take a look at the profile of how it determines when and where it will adjust your ignition timing. I honestly understand about 50% of what this system could do at best, and I'm just kind of working my way through to try to see if I can get it all. I understand it is good enough that I feel comfortable trying to start the car. So once you get the car, well, I guess there's idle control as well. So you can adjust your idle air controller. You can do a few different things here. You can set your target RPMs. Yeah, this is your target RPM depending on the temperature. So pretty neat stuff. I guess one thing I can't do because I'm not plugged into the car right now, but you see this button up here that says offline. When you're plugged into the car, that goes online. And once you're online, that lets you then hook up to your the ECU, and you can upload firmware, meaning you essentially the latest driver version from Holley. You can put that back onto your ECU so it matches what, like I'm using V5 up here, so it'll make sure that it is compatible that way. You can push tunes down to the car. You can do a whole bunch of fun stuff, and you can even use pull up the gauge cluster here, and when you're plugged in, it will live spit out all of these parameters as you are as the engine is running, right? So it's pretty neat. It's pretty powerful for tuning. Like I said before, because I'm only hooked up to a desktop and not a laptop, I can't really do too much of this. I can play around with the RPM and some other stuff, or the fuel pressure and other jazz, but can't do too much. And probably the last thing, the big thing that everybody always tells you when you go in the Holley forums, if you can't get your car to start, the first question is, did you do a throttle setting procedure? So the throttle, the sensor has to learn, or the ECU has to learn what the various throttle positions are. So you start with it closed at 0, you ramp it all the way, you follow its instructions, you ramp it all the way to fully open, then you go to fully closed, then you go to fully open and fully closed, and it essentially learns the voltages all the way through that range so that it can calibrate your TPS, right? So that's the gist of it. Get the last thing that it can do, I guess, that I didn't mention is it can data log. So you can download a log of when you try to start your car, all the sensors are spitting out information for RPM, for everything else. and essentially the ECU can remember all of that. So if you're having problems, whether it's getting your car started or after it's started, you can't get it to perform the way you want, you can send your data log to a tuner, to somebody, and they can adjust your calibration. They can email it back to you, and you can upload it to the car and see if it makes a difference. So it's a pretty cool function. So yeah, that's the Holley EFI system.